friends, welcome back to Kiki's Closet. Today we are celebrating the unsung heroes of musical theater, music directors. It's time to share their stories. Let's go.
Come and play in Kiki's Closet today.
Please help me welcome four of Broadway's magical musicians that I am so lucky to call my friends.
Cynthia Meng, Macy Schmidt, Patrick Sulken, and Jacob Yates.
Hey everybody, welcome to Kiki's Closet. I am so grateful that you're all here with me today. I've been talking to so many actors on this show, and I felt like it was a great opportunity to talk to other people that work in this business. So I gathered the best in the biz, this generation of music directors and musicians, and I'm so excited to chat with you. My first question is, I want to know what your first memory of music is.
Okay, so my family, luckily when I was really young growing up in Kentucky, they somehow decided to put me in these little children's music lessons, but it's some usually hippie-ish teacher person is beating a tambourine for a bunch of infants. And so that was truly my first exposure to music, I believe. But fast forward to a few years later, my mom used to always vacuum the house. It's such a vivid memory, but she would vacuum the house listening to Phantom of the Opera and Evita. What better ways to get exposed to musical theater? But of course I didn't know that it was musical theater. I just assumed these were awesome songs that my mom liked to vacuum to. It was only later that I, when I saw Wicked, that I fully started to put the pieces together and figure out what theater was and why I loved it so much.
My first memory of music is playing piano, my Hanon, just because I was classically trained from a young age. So that's my first real memory of being pushed into music. But the musical theater answer is that, similar to I think a lot of people from this generation, Wicked was a huge deal for me, and being in middle school and kind of hearing that for the first time, and it was really important in my life. I feel I remember being I don't know what this is. My family certainly didn't introduce me to musical theater because they came from China, where that wasn't really a thing, at least in the Broadway sense. So it was my first real exposure to this kind of American art form.
My story is actually pretty similar to Jacob's. My parents live in rural Ohio, so I spent a lot of time in cars, driving long distances to go to the grocery store and school. And my mom has always been a casual musician, singing at church and whatnot. But for a casual musician, she was really intense about my musical training. So as soon as I could read, I was in piano lessons and was always told, you can quit piano when you graduate high school. For some arbitrary reason, I was classically trained and played for a long time, but also in those long car rides, we would listen to the cast albums of Phantom of the Opera and a chorus line over and over and over again. So as long as I can remember, I can sing the entire scores of Phantom and chorus line.
Do you have a favorite song in a chorus line?
It was always Nothing for me.
Yes, me too. I was always Jan Morales.
I did not do the piano lesson thing, did not do the young music lesson thing. My parents were more athletes and not in the musical or artistic sense. So my earliest genuine music memory is definitely being at Disney World, which I only have now realized is just immersive theater, where there's music playing at you and speakers in a bush, and you don't even know what's going on all the time.
The music that they play in the bushes is always musical theater. They do Hello Dolly, and it's Music Man, and there was an Oklahoma, which is perfect when you're walking down Main Street, USA, hearing these, nostalgic musical theater numbers.
The fireworks show arrangement, which now has been discontinued, but specifically the Wishes fireworks show arrangement, I feel that my earliest sense of figuring out oh, I know all these Disney songs, but they sound a little bit different all put together like this, I think was probably the first subconscious understanding of what arranging maybe was. And then I think in middle school at some point, I had a friend whose older brother was in our high school musical, 42nd Street. And she took me to it, and they did opening scene where the curtain only raises to their ankles, and they do this huge opening tap number. And I was completely just losing my mind over it. And then that was it. And then I started teaching myself piano and figuring out, okay, how does this thing that I feel when I'm at Disney World fit into this thing that I feel when they're tapping? And then it kind of just went from there.
So what I find is so interesting about this group is that all four of you have different degrees. Cynthia, you studied computer science at Harvard, and Jacob studied the cello at CCM, and Macy, you studied music theory, and then Patrick, music education. So what's so interesting is when we talk to actors, we're all usually just trained in musical theater or acting. But what that says to me is that you're all so well-rounded, and I want to know how important that is in finding success in this business.
I love this topic. It's tricky, right? It's like a blessing and a curse that we all can come at this sort of similar goal that still looks very different depending on who attains it and how you attain it, but from such different ways. So I think that's really amazing about this sort of industry and this career, but it's also really hard, it's a constant negotiation with yourself, I think, because in this day and age, 2020, especially after a pandemic, we don't yet know what that's going to look like. But the trend certainly before was it actually was helping me get jobs because I can do this, and this. I was finally able to reach a place where I could combine all my interests and all the things that I'm trained in. But that road to that sort of moment where things started opening up and it was yes, I'm doing this. I'm in a good place. I'm where I want to be. It was really difficult. A lot of people, especially a lot of old school people in this business, were the first to say, nope, we only want people that are good at one thing, one thing, otherwise you're going to spread yourself too thin, or people want to pigeonhole you. So I think it's just a very personal sort of conversation you have with yourself. So you have to really be honest with yourself and say, am I actually good at this, at a level that New York City will accept? Everybody's talented in New York, so you do have to be good. I think it really does behoove you to explore all your interests and all the things you can offer in this world, because music directing is so broad. So while it was very difficult at times, I'm really glad that I kept up both my cello and my piano and my conducting interests. I find them all to go very well together.
Going back to the well-rounded part, I've seen most of his Jacob shows, but you not only played cello, but also you were conducting,
Yes.
you had to do it all. So when it comes to hiring people, I'm sure you're very marketable in the sense that you can play and also you can cover conducting.
String players and conductors, in the way that music is played and interpreted, string playing and conducting is really they go hand in hand. The string players are closest to the conductor in the full orchestra. So for me, in learning conducting throughout my years, and training, it didn't seem odd. But when I do knock on certain doors and stuff and be I'm right for your show, or, in whatever scenario that sort of conversation happens, it usually is now, it's me saying, hey, you may not have thought of this, but I can play cello in your band and also sub-conduct for you. So if you make me the associate music director plus the cello chair, you don't have to hire a second keyboard player, which in Broadway hiring sort of terms is very trendy right now. In the days of Les Mis and stuff, when they really came onto the scene, those sort of iconic sounds were kind of moving into sort of a trendier Alex Lacamoire, awesome, fierce string playing world. And sometimes when you make that decision in your budget, you can't afford to have another keyboard player. So I've been lucky that scenario has worked out quite a few times now for me. And I hope it keeps working out. It's kind of my dream to be able to do both hand in hand.
I got a degree in something different. I had a kind of bad falling out with music when I went to college, just because I was okay, well, I don't really want to be a classical pianist, and I guess there's nothing else for me to do but play piano, so I'll just do something else altogether. So when I graduated from college, I got a full-time job as a coder, but I got to the city, and that was the important thing. I had an inkling in my mind that this theater thing sounds kind of cool because I had been exposed to it professionally in school in a few ways. But it took me a couple years before I even made the jump to be a freelancer, because I was so scared of that. I was really terrified. And so there were a couple years where I was just gigging on the side and also doing the full-time job and just being okay, I'm gonna make this work as long as humanly possible, and made a few missteps along the way, totally spread myself too thin in a couple of areas, and it was just a good lesson to learn. But I remember having that fear of I don't know if like I'm supposed to do this because I didn't get a degree in it, and then also like I don't know if I'm supposed to do this for the rest of my life. And at the point when I finally quit my job and went freelance, I remember thinking, you told yourself if you could make this work, if you could like feel like you had network and enough going for you that like you could probably sustain yourself, then you would quit. And I had to like really come to terms with like, okay, it's possible. You have to work really hard for it and you have to give up other parts of your life, but you also will be able to be really fulfilled in the things that you do. And that was a really important realization for me. And that was kind of when I made the jump to really pursue this path.
And in terms of pursuing this business and finding a career on Broadway and in New York, it's a little different from acting, because acting, we can go to open calls, we audition, where in music, you kind of just have to know somebody. Does it feel exclusive in some ways?
I mean, I guess the short answer is make friends and be good at what you do, which I feel like I've heard Jacob say a bunch of times. I probably stole that from him. But like, yeah, it's, like be friendly and nice and be like good to people in the way that you treat people, and then have the skills to back it up and do that for long enough.
There's a lot of haste when hiring a music department for a Broadway show or a lab or something, which there's like trouble inherent in that, but often hiring is done by who you know and who is there and who you know can get the job done. So being a person with enough tools in your tool belt that is there and available, honestly. At least when I first moved to the city, I played the game of let's say yes to as many opportunities as possible, meet as many people as possible, and do as much work for free as possible until that no longer becomes tenable, which worked out well. You build a network, and as long as people like working with you and assume that you can get the job done, that is often the route that people take.
So much of it for me was also, you don't go home for Christmas this year. You can't go home for this, blah, 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 blah. Just because I always was so committed to, if someone calls me for a gig, any type of gig, and I've had some wild gigs, as I'm sure we all have, I just had it in my head that I had to, oh no. Yeah, you just have to, I think at the beginning of your journey, you really have to be available, and you have to be someone, like if someone thinks of you, if they're like, oh, I'm thinking of Jacob Yates right now, you want them to smile, right, when they think of you. So then the call is not that much further away from the smile, right? Like it's easy to just to pick up the phone and say like, oh yeah, I love working with this kid, that's just what it's about. And you have to be around. And it's really hard for a lot of people, right? Because being around in New York City takes a lot of money. So what's the balance between like survival jobs, commitment, and like, it's really different for everyone. It's certainly really hard to break in. I think that's the most difficult part of this whole scenario we find ourselves in, breaking in and having someone take a chance on you.
My next question is for both ladies. Would you say that this business is male dominant still?
Yes, I would. I would say that. I would say that very much. I would say I felt really lucky to like just start working here as communities like Maestro were being formed, where like, it's really hard to imagine having come to New York like 10, 15 years ago when like that was not a thing. And as I talked to women who did come to New York in that time, it sounds like it was significantly harder. So I definitely acknowledge that distinction. But also I'm noticing that like, it's the same thing that I kind of see happening with like actors versus creative team roles, right? Like producer needs show to look more diverse. So you fill the diversity roles with those that are visible, so you get clapped for. And I see that happening in pits a lot as opposed to creative team roles, where it's like, oh, well, look at the pit. We have these women instrumentalists. In the past 20 years on Broadway, out of over 200 different orchestrators, 7 were women. None of the 7 women ever got a job twice in those 20 years as an orchestrator. There's, I think, the second ever female contractor on Broadway was supposed to be this year on Six the Musical. So it's like the roles that you don't see playing their instruments in the pit every night, it's actually like more tragic than we think it is. Though I think that like because of organizations like Maestra, music directors specifically and instrumentalists have like gotten a huge boost of visibility in the last 4 to 5 years.
Can you tell us what Maestra is?
Maestra is a wonderful organization founded by Georgia Stitt that's all about bringing like visibility and support to women who make the music and like theater music. So I think it started mostly like for composers, for like female composers, and now it's become like music directors and instrumentalists, and it has expanded in that they're a nonprofit. They do lots of like workshops and networking and mentor things, and they have a directory where you can like look up female musicians and by region and by expertise and experience and all these sorts of things. Did I meet Cynthia through it?
I'm not sure, but that sounds right.
It's possible, yeah.
Well, I first of all retweet everything Macy said. And I also want to plug, Macy has an awesome initiative organization that she founded herself called the Broadway Sinfonietta. So you guys should look that up. Yes, I think it's male dominated. Yes, I think I have actually been very lucky that, you know, I kind of came like into my career when, you know, finding a female music person was kind of hot. And that has worked for better and for worse sometimes. Sometimes it's great and, you know, like you make the most of all the opportunities that kind of came to you because of that. But also sometimes you are like, oh, am I like making you feel better about your show? Like, is my presence here just for you to like pat yourself on the back and say, look, you know, look, there's one. So there's been, you know, a double-edged sword to that.
For our final question, I want to know what changes you would like to see in this business post-COVID, now that we've been through this whole Black Lives Matter movement.
I am actually really grateful for organizations like We See White American Theater and like Musicians United for Social Equity for using their emotional energy and critical thinking to come up with essentially lists of demands for the theater as we come back. Because I think from the top, there hasn't been a lot of direction for the industry as a whole. And as we've seen from the handling of the pandemic from the federal government, like a piecemeal response is not what anybody needs. Like I said before, a lot of hiring decisions, each Broadway show is essentially its own company. And I would love to see less haste and more thought put into how teams are constructed with equity. I think the industry could use some sort of centralized equity and inclusion council or human resources or some sort of governing body that we don't currently have that makes sure that everyone feels safe at work, because someone working off Broadway as a music assistant has a much different experience than the rehearsal accompanist at Hamilton.
I hope to move to a place where we can like find real equity and real like inclusion, and as opposed to just surface level initiatives in the future. But I do think it's moving there, which is good.
I've just been thinking a lot about how the surface conversations and stuff and the changes that we already started to like see in terms of like diversity and stuff and diversity hires within cast and blah 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 that really don't do much for the cause and like the dismantling of those issues within the business. But I really look forward to like, you know, theater owners like shaking it up. It's not the same families that have run these theaters for all of time. You know, I think it starts from there, from producers, getting more types of producers with different stories that they respond to and different voices that they can lift up and let us hear on a Broadway stage.
For shows that end up running for a long time, I find it really important that people like what they do, right? And I think that there is maybe another generation that the people on this call are not part of. We're like a younger sort of crew for Broadway generally, specifically with musicians. And I think people like us, we really want to be here. We really want to be working on shows. We want to tell the story through music, right? And I look forward to when more people like that get the jobs.
I think that it's kind of a lazy cop-out to like satisfy your diversity quota where like the audience can see those people. So something that I would like to see is the roles that are hired in a quick text behind a closed door that like all never interact with the company, that almost no one ever hears about, which leads to like 2 or 3 people having a monopoly on those roles in an entire industry, people having like 20 shows at once. To start, I would love for that to be talked about. I think that we're already kind of seeing that with like things like diversity reports, and like we're seeing a lot of things coming out on like social media that are like studying and reporting on what's happening in those sorts of roles. And so I think the pressure to have the people who make the show be as diverse as the people who make the face of the show would be very helpful.
I want to thank you all so much for being here today, being part of Kiki's Closet. You all really are very, very inspiring, and it makes me very excited for the future of music on Broadway. And I wish you all a wonderful day, and I hope to see you all real soon. Take care.
Come on and come and play in Kiki's Closet today.